If you're interested in particles or real-time visual effects and spawning 2 million of something very easily, come to this talk. So this is going to be a talk about creating advanced GPU particle simulations using a new tool to Unity called the VFX Graph. And it's a new tool that we're developing. It's coming out quite soon, but it's available now in preview to download and use. And most of this talk is actually going to be visual stuff in the editor showing what it can do and things like that. So at a very high level, it's a GPU-based simulation system. So it spawns particles or spawns outputs particles that do various different things. And because it's GPU-based, we can spawn 100,000, 500,000, 1 million, 2 million particles, all simulating in real time. So it's aimed at real-time visual effects. It's a visual node-based interface. So it has a series of blocks that interconnect. So instead of programming all these particles are spawned, you can instead add blocks to tell something's a color or it's a certain size and things like this. It's very, very easy and straightforward to use, as I'll show you. And it supports various external data. So for example, if you make a point cloud cache, you can import that in, and I'll show you that bit later on, or sign distance fields and things like that. You can feed that in and spawn 2 million particles using a point cloud. It's really, really cool. And it supports Unity's new HD render pipeline as well. So I'm actually going to jump to Unity. I literally have 3 slides for this whole talk, and actually just show you what it can do. So we have a couple examples here. Eventually. So this is the Unity logo using a vector field to basically spawn these particles and move them around with physics. And each of those individual little wisps is a little particle, all happening entirely in real time. We had to put the logo in there somewhere. It also works with Unity's lighting and volumetric system. So as you can see here, we have this kind of aura taking place, and the light is then sort of bending through. So out of the box, rather than it just working by itself, it works with Unity's lighting, Unity's shadows, Unity's volumetric fog. So you can combine it with a lot of tools that Unity already supports and has, including post-processing with this kind of depth of field right here. Another example is kind of event-based particles. So in this case, we have an individual firework that's shooting up. That's using the VFX graph, and then it's spawning all these little fireworks here. So rather than each VFX graph having kind of one purpose, you can stack up multiple things. One for the rocket shooting up, one for the explosion, another one for the small little shattering pieces. So you can create some quite complex layered up systems using this tool. And you can see here it's reflecting in the water and working with all of Unity's different features. There's also a kind of fluid system. So each of these individual balls is a particle. So as you can see here, we have these large rolling balls that move around and move all of them independently entirely with this kind of fluid type physics. And this is all happening in real time. None of this is pre-baked in, which is super cool. I kind of want to get this into AR, so having all these balls like scatter around on the floor would be super awesome. Yep. Next example is kind of sequence-based stuff. So you can have particles doing things over a certain amount of frames. So rather than like a fireball that's constantly on fire, you can have it glow and then spawn mini particles and kind of have lots of things happening in a sequence. So here we have this kind of more toon-style power-up effect that's taking place, all simulated directly inside the graph. So it's not just setting something on fire. You can have something set on fire and that fizzles out over time, turns to ash, and have all these things happening in a sequence. This is actually part of the Unity branding recreated using this. And each of these is an individual stretch particle that's moving around, all in real time. Each with an individual color, each with an individual direction. So you can kind of give data to each of these particles to go a certain place and do a certain thing, all very easily. Next one is a simple sort of AR radar sequence. And again, this is built up of lots of different tiers. So for example, that bottom dial is a VFX graph created by a collection of nodes. And then you have the kind of rings. That's another graph. And then each of those individual elements here is a particle moving around. So again, you can stack all these different things together directly using this tool and simulate all this taking place. And it actually disappears as it moves to the next scene, which is pretty cool. This is actually spawning lots of points using these particles. Then it's spawning more particles to connect them together. So you can not only spawn lots of particles, but then connect them up to create some kind of wireframe simulation, which we have here. So it'd be super cool if you could pass in like map data and simulate on a grid lots of different things using this line and point and edge type tool. This one is an example of kind of a face. So this face is actually a point cloud of data, and I'll show you how to hook that earlier. It's generated in some other tool than Unity, brought into Unity, and then each of the points on that face is then an individual particle. So each of those sort of like shards is a particle that's constantly transforming independently, and they all have reflectivity, cast shadows, affected by light. So you could do some really powerful stuff by integrating this with various tools in Unity, including glowing, post-processing, things like this. And that's the same face. This looks horrible, but like it's kind of a bubonic face. And actually, the face is of the developer of the tool, which is quite funny. No, he doesn't actually look like that. Like the original face is his face. Obviously, we probably wouldn't hire someone who looks just like that, which that's kind of, you should probably go to hospital. This is another example of kind of stacking up different things. So each of those individual little pieces is an individual particle being told to shadow and move in these different ways. So you can create some quite complex things using this same tool. I think I'm almost at the end of these examples. It's a Doctor Strange portal, reflected, moving around. We should have really put something on the other side, which would be really cool. And that's all happening in real time as well. None of that is pre-rendered or pre-baked. This is an example of more like a scenario or a scene where you use VFX Graph to create all this nice smoke taking place in an environment or a level. So it sort of fits into different scenarios. That's another one of the Unity logo dissolving. Yeah, we have a lot of these. I'll show you how to use it in a second. Each of these butterflies is an individual particle with individual flap and direction and things like this. So these are all behaviors you can give to the particles using this system. So you can also do sort of some type of weather effects. So each of those snow particles are simulated. And each of those blades of grass is a particle as well, so you could have some kind of wind going through your environment. So kind of the point of showing you all these examples is you don't just use it for, say, an explosion or smoke. You can use it for environment stuff. You can use it for weather systems. You can use it for all different things, which is why we've called it a visual effect graph, not necessarily a particle graph. So yeah, and you can walk around, and I think the grass also moves out of the way of the player, which is pretty cool. There's an example of some turrets. And we're back here. So what I'm going to do is I'm now going to open up the graph and show you a couple of different things that you can do with it out of the box. So if I jump back into Unity and load up my demo scene. So we have here this spawning particle system here. This is actually when you create a new VFX Graph asset in Unity. This is the default. You have this very beautiful green and red and white circles. They look super amazing, right? No one nodded, so yeah, no, they don't. They look horrible. So this is the default graph. And I could take this and modify it and tweak it and show you how this works with this graph. But instead, I'm going to show you a different one, another template, because we have different templates for getting started. We have this one, if we want to create some upward funnel type particles. But instead, what I'm going to do is inside the graph interface, and I should probably plug in power. Is I'm actually going to delete all of this and then create a brand new graph. So if I go to System in this interface, you'll notice here that we have a couple of different particle systems for different formats, like an empty one and different templates. And the really cool thing is we have this as an example graph, or this other one as a template, which when you see is pretty insane as a default template graph. So each of these individual little pieces that are flying out, and I can actually select the graph and slow it down a little bit. each of these is an individual particle that's being simulated to move away from that sun. So rather than typical Unity before, which had some particle system where you'd have like 100 or 200, this is currently spawning 65,000 particles, but we can increase this and decrease this however we want. Let's go back to normal speed. So as I said before, this is going to change. I'm going to put the face on it in a second. It's a node-based system. So we have this interface, which I have on the right here, which basically shows a series of blocks. And each of these blocks has a different purpose for the particle system. The top one is very self-explanatory. It spawns the particle system. It says, how do you spawn? Are you a series of bursts? Do you apply with physics over here? Do you spawn when someone pushes spacebar or clicks a button and things like this? In this case, it's constantly spawning 25,000 particles. So let's increase that up a lot higher. Actually, let's drop it down so you can see that instead now the particle system actually adapts real time as we change and sculpt it. So rather than typing in some values and then compiling and hope that it looks good, you can instead actually just increase and change your values live. So it's constantly spawning this, which is what we want. Next here we have a capacity. So this is kind of like in the initialize phase, which it means when the particle is created, what does it actually do? So now we've created a particle, what is its behavior? It's kind of woken up, and what is its purpose? So capacity is currently 65,000 particles, but we can obviously like increase that up significantly more. So you can notice we've now got 100,000. Let's go 1 million. Yeah, so we now have 1 million particles, all spawning, all simulating in real time. And this is a Razer laptop. It's not like some high-end beefy machine. It's a laptop I carry around in my backpack and play Hearthstone on. So it's nothing super powerful. So we have here this sort of particle system which can fly around and do different things with. So now we have 1 million particles. Let's have a look at some other things a part of the system. So we're spawning our particles as a sphere. And then we're setting them to have a random amount of life. And what you'll notice with the visual effect graph as you use it is there'll be lots of these little nodes that do different things, like I want you to set the color over time, or I want you to apply physics over time, or I want you to turn into a cube or something like this over time. And each of these blocks can be added by going to that section, hitting spacebar, and then you have this big list of all the different blocks you can add. So you can see here I could turn this into a line or a sphere or a torus and do different things. So currently it's being told you should be a sphere. So if I turn this off, it's actually just going to spawn a line because we haven't told it to be a sphere or anything like that. But we do want it to be a sphere to begin with. Next is the update sections. This is what happens as the particle over time. So now you spawn it, what do you want it to do? Do you want it to fly to a particular point? Do you want it to, like the fireworks, shoot in the air and then explode over time? Kind of what is your purpose in your scene? In this case, it's applying a thing called a vector field, which I'll come back to a bit later on. And that's taking it from the sphere. So if I now refresh the particle system, if I now compile the particle system, it starts as a sphere and then sort of then applies some kind of velocity over time. That's what this is doing here. And I'll come back to this in a little bit. Next is the output. And this is kind of the end of the particle. So now you spawned it. What do you actually want it to look like? Do you want it to be red, blue, a quad, a sphere? Do you want it to cast light? You have all these different options of how you want to render the particle system. So each one of these 1 million particles is being affected by this vector field force, and then is being told you're this size, you're this color, and things like this. So for example, if I increase the size, they can become really big. So we've now got really chunky particles, but let's go back. I can actually turn these on and off. So I could say, I don't want you to change size over time, so let's turn that off. So they actually remain like small and wispy. I don't want you to change your color over time. Instead, you just want to be like a nice white aura. And you can, of course, go in and tweak things even more. So someone shout out a color, not red or yellow. Purple, cool. People usually say pink or black or white, which messes with it a little bit, but yeah. So if we want it to be sort of, over the life of the particle, it sort of starts white, then goes to yellow, then red and fades out. But if we go to, do you have a particular hexadecimal value in mind, or are you just happy with like this? 4200FF. Okay. Wow. I'll just set this to be green. I'll use the color picker. So you notice here we now have this particle system simulating where each particle over its life has this certain settings. And of course, you could go in, you can randomize all these values. So you could say each particle has a different color, or each particle has certain settings and things like this. So for the time being, I'm going to turn off orient along velocity. You notice that it instead just spawns. And let's set the size. So now it's a lot thicker. And honestly, you could just have fun. I always sit on trains and just play with this all day, and people sit next to me like, what are you doing? Like, it just looks so weird. So if I now turn off this vector field force, what it's going to do is it's actually going to spawn these 1 million particles just as a sphere. It doesn't have any force over time. Of course, I could go into this update block and apply a gravity. So we now have 1 million particles all applying some kind of gravity, and let's go up and things like this. So you can already sculpt, so this is going to go off way into the distance, some pretty interesting different things. I'll turn off gravity for the time being. Now, this is spawning a sphere, but maybe I don't want to spawn a sphere. Maybe I want to spawn something else, such as that person's face in the examples earlier on. And like I said, that's point cloud data that's already been baked and that we can use. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to turn off position sphere, so it now just spawns 1 million particles. That's 1 million particles being spawned in the same place, which is pretty ridiculous. And instead, I'm going to add a, wow, there's a lot of nodes. So let me just scroll down through set position from a map. And let me get the point cache. And select is called position map 2. So what you'll notice is that we can add different nodes and then connect them. So this is taking this face point cache, and it's giving me a position. So what I'm going to do now is just plug this into this slot. And it now spawns the 1 million particles using the position data from that point cache. So you now have this sort of weird aura face, and each of these is an individual particle that's glowing, which is pretty cool. And of course, I can now go to this and then turn on gravity. So we now have this kind of strobing VFX graph moving up. Or I can instead deform the face and create this kind of weird wispy thing. So instead of spawning the particles as a sphere, we're now spawning as a face. And then, of course, I could, dissolve the face in different ways. So yeah, you can do all sorts of different things. Now, I kind of have to wrap up a little bit. So what I'll now show you is something pretty weird, which is that we now have each particle. So we spawn 1 million particles. There we go. We then spawn, I'll count the zeros. Yep, that's the right amount. It's being recorded. Someone online will say, that wasn't 1 million, that was 100,000 or something, as people do. We then tell them to spawn as a face. We then tell them to have this, gravity applied to it, this sort of like, this vector field force. And then we're telling it to be a quad. And what you might notice is that all the way up to this end stage, we haven't actually told it what it to look like, which is why we can now do something like take these particles. Let's say we want them to be lit spheres. So we're now going to spawn 1 million lit spheres. And then we actually connect this into here. And then we delete that previous one. So we now have 1 million individual lit spheres all spawning. We can then obviously set the size, and we'll set the smoothness, set the metallicness. So these are now 1 million individual sphere objects. If I turn off the vector field, we now have, you can zoom right in and see each of the spheres individually. And again, my laptop is totally OK. It's all happening in real time. Apply this, and then just have this face dissolving. And let's do something like set a color from the gradient. And you're really hooked on purple. So let's, what was the value again? So we now have, well, they sort of start purple, but then let's make them less. Yeah, they sort of start purple. Yeah, so we can now basically have millions and millions of spheres all simulating, all in real time, all doing some pretty cool stuff like this. Yeah, it's amazing stuff. We can set the size. So we now got some large, yeah, just very quickly you can see how you can sculpt and add all these different nodes and play with this system. I've kind of run out of time. If I now cut back to my 3 slides, So that's basically the VFX Graph, or an overview. We have a lot more information online, blog posts, videos, talks, tutorials, all these different things available online. You can actually download it by just going into Unity, going to the window, and then going to the window option, and going to this thing called a package manager. And I'll show you very quickly kind of what the purpose of that is. So if you go to Window and then Package Manager, this will then open this window, which basically has all the different features that Unity supports. And you can kind of piecemeal choose what you want in your project. So if you're making a 2D game, you don't want to add VR, right? Because that doesn't make sense. So you can actually disable the VR content, so that's not being included sort of in your project. And what you might notice here is we have, right at the bottom here, this visual effects graph. So if you install that and set that up, you can then start playing with this tool and experimenting with it. It's a really powerful tool. People are already doing amazing things. Like the examples I showed you is just made by like a few people internally at Unity who have this, but we always find it way more exciting and interesting when it gets into the wild and people start doing all these things we didn't consider people would use for this tool. So if you use it and you make something with it, contact us, let us know. Come to the forums. Our developers are all there wanting to know what people do with it and show us lots of amazing different particles. And if I see thousands of 1 million sphere face dissolves, I'll know exactly where all that inspiration comes from. So thank you. I hope this was very interesting, and thanks for coming along.